So first of all, before people feel like, oh, I can go eat lunch now, we do hope that you can stay on and participate with the advisory committee. This will be relatively brief. The idea was for them to be able to ask you some questions about your part of the project or provide some comments. So we definitely want this to be interactive with the whole team here. And I do think it will go pretty quickly and we'll be able to wrap up pretty soon. So first of all, let me introduce the advisory committee. We have a half dozen people on the advisory committee. I've been asked to facilitate this. All the people on the advisory committee, including myself, do not have a financial involvement in the project, but we have a few farmers who are on the committee, a couple of whom are involved in the on-farm trials. So one of those is Trey Hill, who some of you know is a large farmer in Maryland, grows corn and soybeans and some small grains, has been no-till for a long time and been using cover crops for quite a few years. And Trey has been involved with some of the earlier on-farm work with Stephen Mirsky and now as part of the PSA on-farm trials. Likewise, Curtis Furr is a farmer in North Carolina who's been involved with the on-farm trials. Unfortunately, Curtis had a conflicting meeting with his state soybean board, so could not be on during this hour, but he's been participating. Another farmer is Keith Burns from Nebraska. And although Keith is not involved in the on-farm trials, I don't believe Keith has a major role in what's happening with cover crops. Many of you know of Keith through his work with a cover crop seed company he co-founded with his brother called Green Cover Seed, and he remains heavily involved in that as president of that company. So Keith is wearing two hats as a farmer advisor and also an ag industry representative. Also from ag industry, we have Risa Damasi. Risa is based out in Oregon with Grassland Oregon, which is one of the few companies that actually has been doing breeding of cover crops and distributes a number of cover crop varieties across the country. Risa has also been a president of the American Seed Trade Association, so she's well connected with what's happening in the seed industry, especially the cover crop seed industry across the country. And then we wanted to have an NRCS representative. Normally that's been Bianca Mobius-Clune, who many of you know heads the Soil Health Division. She was tied up with a national NRCS call this morning, so it's being represented by Brandon Smith, who is also part of the Soil Health Division and has been involved with this project from time to time. So with that quick introduction, I want to just open it up to the advisory committee. First of all, to ask any questions you have of people involved with the project, and then we'll turn it open to your recommendations or comments that you have. And again, this can be interactive with other members of the group here. So let me start with Risa, and then I'll go to Keith. Risa, I think you were on for quite a bit of the morning. And Keith, you were on part of the morning. I know, see if either of you has any questions you want to raise or particular points. So Risa, let me start with you.
Boy, I always hate being first, but it was kind of like drinking from a fire hose of all that information, but it was really interesting. I really appreciated Orly, I'm not sure if I'm saying that name right, and Juliet, that decision tool and the user experience, I think is going to be really interesting to see that evolve, because I think that is an important piece. It's more a statement than a question, but like I said, I'm still kind of absorbing the information that I heard this morning.
So Keith, do you have a particular question to start with? Keith may have stepped away from a moment.
Sorry, Rob, I had to take a quick phone call there, but just jump back on here.
So yeah, Keith, I know you've been off and on the session this morning. Did you have any questions from anything you heard this morning you wanted to ask about? Just to start with, and then we'll get into comments here in a moment.
Yeah, I was kind of in and out a little bit. Enjoyed the parts that I was able to watch. I guess I was particularly interested in the cover crop decision tool that I saw being demonstrated there from the Northeast Cover Crop Council. I thought looked very interesting. What's the time frame for that beta? I know they talked about beta testing, but I don't know. Maybe I missed where they talked about what that timeline was.
Stephen, you want to address that?
I'm so sorry. Can you repeat that question, Keith?
Yeah, sure.
The time, the date for what?
that decision, the cover crop selection decision tool that I think the Northeast Cover Crop Council was demonstrating there. They talked about beta testing. Are they currently beta testing that, or is that going to be beta tested?
I can expand.
Okay,
on
I
that.
got you. I'll let Juliet answer that question.
Sure,
Okay.
yeah. So I'm Victoria and I are running the beta testing process, and so we just did a first phase of it. And so the idea of the beta testing is that we release the current development status to our ideal end users, and they test it and they give us feedback, and then we do a little bit more development and like refine the tool. And so we're going to be working on that for the next about 6 weeks or so. And then by the end of January, we'll do a second round of beta testing. And we'll take all of their feedback and refine a little bit more. And each step, we get closer and closer to like a publicly usable tool. And the goal is to reach that deadline by the end of February.
Okay, that's exciting. It looked like a good tool. So good work on that.
Great, thank you.
Keith, did you have any other questions from things you heard?
No, I think that was mostly it. Thanks, Rob.
Okay, sure. And we'll go to comments here in a moment from the advisory committee. I know Brandon Smith and Trey Hill heard just the part on the decision tools, but either Trey or Brandon, did you have any questions about the decision tools, that little segment that you heard there?
I guess I have one question. This is somewhat self-serving. As I've progressed into planting more and more green and no-tilling and getting higher accumulations of biomass each year, and we've had a couple wet years, I'm running into some pretty significant disease pressure with soil-borne diseases. So as you do the decision-making tool, is there any chance of incorporating either pest and disease management within that? Because that's something where I'm starting to struggle and debate what to do personally as I get farther along in the progression of soil health. Might be too specific, but.
That's a great question, Trey. I'll just highlight, that some of these data sources that we're taking and modeling, we have very clear pathways to how they get into the decision support tools. And some of them, we're just starting to really cut our teeth on that. And so I think, I don't know if you understood yesterday, we heard excellent.
Chris, you're cutting out.
Oh, sorry. I don't know if I'm back. That's being planted. Am I back?
Yes.
Okay. That pest experiment is being planted experiment stations around the country, but at the same time, we're embedding some of that same monitoring into the on-farm trial so that we can get pest interactions across the whole on-farm trial network. But your question, Trey, is then what do we do with it? How do we incorporate that into a decision support tools? I think we haven't even really wrapped our heads around that yet. So if you'd be interested in engaging in that, I think we would love to have your interaction on it.
Okay, and are you guys doing anything? One thing that I started experimenting with this year was in soil testing I'm doing regular soil tests and soil health tests, but also starting to do some DNA testing. Have you guys experimented with any of that? As you've got such a huge network, is there any value in that, or have you looked into it at all?
We have not done anything with that as a network, looking at DNA testing from soil health. Yeah, it's a great question.
Yeah, just to kind of elaborate, Trey, our network is really focusing on what we can do really well with a limited budget across the whole network. I mean, even though we're well funded, you distribute that across 26 plus sites and 100 plus people, and the budgets get thin quick. And so we're, a lot of the various like deep dive soil health measurements are quite costly and hard to navigate for a network of our scale. So we do capture, the things that we think hit some of these short-term economic dynamics, like what we've articulated with pests, insects, disease, water, nitrogen. But we are, where we can, taking some deeper dives. So for example, we did just get a large on-farm grant to expand the PSA network with Indigo Ag. And with that team, Indigo is funding quite a bit of a deep dive on some soil health metrics on some of these different studies we're doing. So some of our on-farm partners, we will be doing some more in-depth soil health measurements, and maybe we can encourage AJ to consider the Trey Hill farm as one of the one of those farms. Anyway.
And it's a good point, and this is Brandon. But one of my thoughts, while you're presenting was, the relationship between the nitrogen calculator and what we're doing with soil health.
I'd love to talk to you more, Trey. This is AJ. But yeah, I can follow up. But yeah, we can definitely talk to you more about our research. I know we've talked in the past before about that too, but we can definitely chat more there.
Okay, sorry, Brandon, go ahead.
Sure. Yeah, didn't mean to cut in. Yeah, I was just curious, we've been working with Kristen Bume at ARS on actually the interpretation of some of the, I guess, as you would say, more expensive soil health metrics. But I'm wondering if there's a way to, before the nitrogen calculator gets nationalized, I guess, if there's a way to collaborate on what the actual inputs are into those two, I would say, calculators, those two models, so that there are similar results that can be drawn from them. Does that make any sense, Stephen?
Yes, absolutely. I'm so glad we got you here, Brandon. I didn't know we were going to get you. So it's awesome to have you here.
Did you want to bring Hannah in on that, Stephen, or anybody else?
I think she's on the call if she wants to respond.
And I guess I can elaborate. I would just say, there were specific things like, soil suborder and specific climate metrics and specific management, sort of inputs that she has going into what she's calling the SHAPE model, the soil health assessment, something prediction. I forget what the acronym stands for, but it would seem to make sense from a continuity perspective if we could make sure we're doing things similar before they're all kind of finalized.
So how would you recommend like a next step around that, Brandon? Should we get kind of a group together to follow up on that specifically?
Yeah, that's what I was thinking, if you're open to it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, well, what I'd like to do now is just open it up for the members of the advisory committee to make general comments now that we've gone through a few of those clarification questions. So the members of the advisory committee, they haven't been coached very much on this. I'll give you just broad latitude here. You can comment on a specific area of this project. And I know it's been a while since some of you have seen all the details, but we've got nitrogen rate studies, as Brandon just alluded to. We have studies, as Trey asked about, related to planting green and some of the pest impacts of planting green. There's the large on-farm trial network with over 100 farmers. And then there's a whole bunch of other work going on with economics, social evaluation through surveys and other metrics, looking at what happens, what we can learn from remote sensing and other tools. And then, as Stephen and his group talked about at the end, building out these decision tools. So you can comment on any specific part of the project, or you can just comment more generally on what you think a huge $10 million project like this needs to be thinking about as we try to move cover crop research and education forward and ultimately get more adoption among farmers. So I guess I'll start with Keith and then do Risa, Trey, and Brandon. How's that? And you can crosstalk on each other if you have a follow-up comment on what you hear. So Keith, I'll turn the floor to you first.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. Well, first of all, yeah, kudos to everybody. It's such a big project and so many different things. It's hard to keep up, especially, from the outside, looking in, it almost seems overwhelming. So great job, everybody, in doing that. I do have a question, and Stephen, you might be able to answer this. I know at one time, was this project looking at trying to develop some new cultivars of either hairy vetch or some winter peas or some different clover? Is that still part of this? Or are you still looking at trying to look at some improved cultivar development and release out of this project? Or are you just really kind of doing that background research and then that somebody will pick that up later?
I gotcha. Yeah, thanks, Keith. I know you've probably seen a number of different presentations from me over the years, and I do try to connect and link up our various different initiatives that we have in place. And so one group that a number of folks on this in PSA as a whole, the Precision Sustainable Ag team, are involved with is the National Cover Crop Breeding Program.
Okay,
And so that group has a lot of overlapping members of PSA. And originally, when we started down this grant proposal, and I may have even touched base with you early back then, we had considered having the breeding team be an element of this grant. And it became clear that it would be too disjointed to connect these teams in that grant. And so we are actually contemplating submitting another SASCAP grant around the breeding team and beyond. And Rob Myers is really that kind of point person, but that's still in the early development stages. But the national breeding team is alive and well. We are maturing as far as protocol development. I mean, as far as cultivar development. And, like, for example, in the case of Hairy Vetch, we already have a number of lines that are outperforming our checks. But so that team does expect to release cultivars in the near future. And it is an ambition to link to PSA as a whole, in that a number of us want to link recommendations that come out of our cultivar work into our decision tools, as well as potentially across common experiments in the network. But that linkage between this network hasn't matured just yet.
Okay, very good. I appreciate that. What is the long-term plan for rolling out and getting a lot of the findings, that you're working with, and maybe even some educational materials around those findings? What is the plan for developing those educational materials and then, making them accessible to the public? What channels are you going to pursue to get this information out to people?
So that would be a good question for Heather Darby. And I know she had something going on. Looks like she has stepped off. Does another member of the extension team want to address that question?
I'm still here.
Oh, there you are. There you are. Oh, you're under the other name. Okay.
Yeah, sorry. Can you repeat the question again?
Sure. Just was wondering what kind of the plan or the strategy was for number one, developing educational materials around some of the findings that either have come out or will come out of these studies, and then number two, what is the platform of how you're going to get that out or make it accessible to people?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Keith. Well, of course, the primary avenue for distribution of the materials is through the cover crop councils. You were probably listening before, there's cover crop councils all over the country, and some especially focused and very active in the program areas. And so that will be a primary avenue to distribute materials on the websites and also through outreach events. And then through, individual states, individual faculty and staff members will also be kind of hosting their own traditional extension, model type events, whether it be field days or workshops or conferences. So there'll be a lot of traditional distribution of materials as well. And we do have a project website, and I'm assuming some of the materials will be posted there as well. I'm not sure if that answers your questions, and certainly if anyone else has anything to chime in with, that would be great.
Yeah, no, thank you.
I think that raises an interesting question, Chris and Stephen. For those of you that are kind of new to these huge projects, one of the earlier ones that happened, a $25 million project, was actually a corn project led out of Iowa State. And I know Linda Prokopi, who's on the call, was involved with that one, and also leading a smaller SASCAP project herself. So one thing that corn cap project did, which I thought was quite nice, was in the later stages of the project, they developed a whole series of kind of farmer oriented as well as more general public oriented materials. So I think Chris and Stephen and team members, that's something we should be thinking about as we look ahead. You know, maybe about a year, we need to think about that more seriously. What's our plan to start putting those materials together? But we should have a plan for that.
Absolutely. That's a great point, Rob.
Okay.
And one thing that
Yep.
I would just add to that too is that like part of the goal of both the water cap and the SAS cap here is to end up with some finer grained understanding of what different groups of growers might need in terms of the kinds of information and how it is communicated. And so that's one of the things that we'll be using some of the social science research to do, is to basically split apart that the traditional kind of communication models and help fine tune them for particular audiences.
Thanks, Jen. Keith, anything else you wanted to hit?
No, I think I'll yield my time to others on the committee here.
Okay. All right. Risa, we'll go to you next.
Well, I like I appreciated Keith's question about the breeding consortium, and I honestly feel really good about that separation, partly because you can focus on, you know, some of the data that you're learning and creating those tools for farmers, and that there isn't the perception of a closed system, that it's only including, and I would say that's maybe a watch out too, as you start putting those pieces back together with these great tools that you're creating. And this is a question too, I guess, how will you be including other breeding programs or other available genetics that are out there, so that the tool is completely as robust as possible? So it's not just, well, we only have these for you to look at, but maybe an open system where they can see the full landscape of what may be available in the cover crop world. And then the other comment and question, I guess, is the same thing. As you develop those tools, it seems like it's very focused on the species or breeding and the data that you're collecting, connecting only with farmers. Is there, but I love the social science piece that came up in some of the tools. It's like, how do we, you know, using some of the tools that you're getting access to, some of these remote tools of how is it expanding? How are the adoption rates are increasing, and why? There may be other parts of the industry missing, such as maybe the ag industry. Rob, I know you and I have talked about, you know, co-ops or, you know, ag retailers, and maybe this is intentional. And so if it's intentionally not part of the process, then that's okay too. I just curious.
Yeah, let's kind of work backwards through that. So first of all, in the industry, I don't think there was any intention of ignoring the role of industry, but even $10 million only goes so far. So Stephen briefly alluded to a follow-up proposal, and I guess this is as good a time as any to mention it to those of you on the call that we are planning to put in, and I'll define who we is in a moment, a follow-up $10 million SASCAP proposal that would be more targeted to growing the cover crop seed industry. So there's roughly $10 million of effort that have been happening over the last few years on cover crop breeding. And Chris Reberg-Horton and Stephen Mirsky have led projects with that, as well as some folks at the Noble Foundation have been involved. And then many of others of you on the call are local sites for testing that new germplasm. But that work is only going to end with improved germplasm and go no further based on current funding. So the idea is to get some additional resources. This new 5-year proposal would be to try to look at how do we scale up the cover crop seed industry, and that involves all kinds of questions, doing regional adaptation trials of new germplasm, making sure that seed is increased, making sure that it's part of decision tools, as Stephen alluded to, and then ultimately that the seed industry is involved in licensing those varieties and delivering them to farmers and there's sufficient supply. So let's say that the new administration comes in and says, you know, we're doing 10 different things to increase carbon sequestration. One of them is cover crops. And by the way, we want to have 50 million or 100 million acres of cover crops. how can we quickly scale up the seed supply and do all the other things that need to happen to make that possible. So in short, that would be the overall scope of the new project. And there'll be invitations going out for people to participate in that proposal that'll build on both the work of this PSA project and the other $10 million investment that's been happening in cover crop breeding to date. So Risa, that's kind of the second part of your question. And then you asked about how these decision tools will help farmers. So Stephen or Juliet or someone working with decision tools want to take that on?
Well, I'd like to highlight one point,
Chris.
Bob. And we can't promise this across all tools because the tools are coming out of very different pipelines across the whole team. But we have talked about that several of them will be available to industry partners to embed in their own products as well. Like, we are a public sector network. Our goal is to maximize use of these products as widely as possible. So the intention, for instance, of the cover crop selector tool, we're going to ride the Northeast's coattails and the Midwest coattails and do that in the Southeast. And the Southeast has already chosen that we want to make that tool available in such a way that, Risa, if you want to embed it in your web page and use it to generate recommended species and information, that all we're going to ask in exchange for that is that it, come with acknowledgement, sort of powered by this tool kind of acknowledgement, because we feel like that's a way to maximize the impact of it. These tools will always be available free, via our different outlets, but they also are able to be incorporated into private sector products where it makes sense.
Chris,
I'm sorry, go ahead, Keith.
Yeah, do you foresee being able, to use like an API call to kind of jump in and out of that, to integrate that with other pieces of software?
That's exactly what we've talked about, Keith. Yes.
Great, thank you.
So just to expand on that. So yeah, that was really well said, Chris. And so just to give some context on private partnerships, I mean, so in the last year, we've generated several more millions of dollars into this team in the form of bringing in more on-farm, private on-farm networks, right? So we've now gotten several grants with Soil Health Partnership, Indigo Ag, Practical Farmers of Iowa, the International Farming Corporation. So all of these private on-farm, collaborative networks are now collaborating with PSA in a number of ways, right? So integrating our IoT systems into their farmer networks greatly expands the amount of data we can generate around how climate and soil and management interact to drive, crop performance, cover crop dynamics, and all the different services we're targeting. So a big part of our tools being more site specific and really, hitting the culture of what we want to create, right? Merging precision agriculture with sustainable agriculture means more references of how climate and soil management intersect. And so that's what these other private on-farm networks are affording us, is just greater coverage across the US. So we've expanded just in this year alone, somewhere around 80 or 90 farm fields across the Midwest and South Central US because of those grants and those partnerships. And it also is translating to exactly what you said, Chris and Keith, which is integrating, our interfaces into offerings from some of these different private sector groups that are trying to provide wholesale recommendation systems to growers. That they're not going to build every product. They're going to rely on some of the rigorous work that these councils have been doing. And so that's certainly part of that enterprise. And then where we are generating co-data, we would also potentially be collaborating on some of those tools as well.
Okay, great. I see we're down to about 7 minutes left. So let's get to Trey for your general comments, Trey, and then we'll finish up with Brandon and his comments.
It was probably covered, and I apologize for not being here all day, but one thing that I'm struggling with is my initial hypothesis was always that yield would increase as soil health increased. That occurred with me for a couple years, and now in some instances I'm seeing that there doesn't appear to be much correlation. So I'm struggling to figure out, I think that farmers, while looking at financials and wanting to save money on things like nitrogen, which I think is imperative, I also would like to know, is it possible to plant green into high biomass and consistently yield with my neighbor who's plowing and doing it conventionally? I think that it should be done, and I think that it can be done, and I think that it will be done. But I think that's something that I would like to see, is that correlation. And if you are tracking so many fields, what is it? And rather than comparing, I know you can't compare it to conventional, because typically the fields, like my fields, are all no-till and it's green versus brown. But I'd like to see that in a linear regression, so that like last year, my beans were low and my corn was high. So I was like, oh, I've got this figured out on corn, but I got to reevaluate my bean mixes. Then this year it was the exact opposite, and I didn't change anything. So I need to know, what does that look like over 10 years? Because my 1 year snapshot and my lack of ability to remember the year before as a farmer precludes me from like looking at it over time. So I think that just straight yield versus maybe biomass accumulate versus cover crops. I mean, I know there's so many different factors and it gets so complicated. And I think we need the horsepower of the intellect of this group, which is much more than the horsepower of the intellect of myself. So that, and then also, what's the critical level of biomass accumulation versus yield in corn and beans? As you get, there's a huge difference for me in planting green into something that's 3 inches tall early, mid-April in Maryland, versus when I get into my later planted stuff where I'm looking at 8-9 tons of biomass. It's an entirely different crop almost. It's an entirely different dynamic. So are you delineating the high biomass versus the low biomass as it correlates to yield? And I know there's so many different factors, because it's harder to plant, it's harder to get seed to soil contact, planting depth, things like that. And then also the effects of chemistry on this as well. I think is one of the things that I'm debating as I look into the regenerative world. You've got your Joel Salatins, your Gabe Browns up here, then you've got the folks in the middle, and then you've got folks like myself and we all think we're regenerative, even though we're farming entirely differently. I talked with a farmer the other day, and he said, I hope they don't take regenerative and ruin it like they have everything else and allow chemicals in regenerative agriculture. I'm going, wait a second. I thought I was doing regenerative and I use a lot of chemicals. I see no problem with chemicals. I'm like, Rick, maybe we need to have a different conversation. We've got to take it a different direction. So I'm going, what is the effect of chemicals on soil health? As I'm spraying fungicide, Ray Weil will say, don't spray any fungicides. And I go, but Ray, I'm getting a 15 bushel yield bump on corn with a shot of Driver Pro. It's nuts and bolts. I mean, it's financially, it's a no brainer. And I'm going, if it is impacting soil health, do I want to give up that money? I don't mind it. But if it's not impacting soil health, then why would I not? Is it Ray's opinion or is it fact? And how does that correlate over the long term? And I know that might be out of the bounds of this group, but these are kind of the questions that I'm starting to ask. Do I need to get away from chemistry altogether for soil health, or am I good using my chemistry? And which chemistry is good and which is bad? I guess, I always thought glyphosate was great. Now everyone says glyphosate's bad. And I'm like, well, I still think glyphosate's great because it's safer to me than paraquat. But I don't think the people that think glyphosate's bad know that the substitute is paraquat. So that's me. I agree with everything Keith said on the education piece. I think it looks terrific to me. I think these are the tools we need. I think you guys are doing a great job. And that was all I had.
Well, thanks, Trey. Those are some good challenges. I'll just quickly say we did kick around that yield question some earlier today, and that'll be an ongoing challenge for the group, is to better evaluate that, including what happens in different weather conditions and so on. So I quickly mentioned that with the advisory committee, for those of you that are researchers on the call, we'll be having them meet with you in smaller groups. We're going to, in January, have a call with Common Experiment 2, and then later we'll have a call to focus more on Common Experiment 1 and the on-farm trials. So we'll get into some more of these detailed questions at that point. But those are good challenges for us to think about, Trey. Let's finish with comments from Brandon, and then I'll turn it back to Stephen and Chris for closing.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. No, I just wanted to applaud the group, especially in the direction that they're going. I think this, what I see as a two-pronged approach, where you're providing the information and the decision support tools along with the education. I think that's just really key. And we're frothing at the NRCS to be able to use these tools that you have. So we're just very excited, and I think it's the right direction to go in. The NRCS is one of the few agencies that is expanding at this point in time. So we're getting more and more people in, and we're servicing more and more customers. And I think the types of tools and the types of educational materials that this group is producing is going to help us a real lot in the future. So thanks.
Thank you, Brandon. Okay, back to Stephen and Chris for closing remarks.
Chris, Chris, I know you're tight on time, so you want to hit this, you want to respond real quick and then I'll hit after you.
I think we're at wrap up time, but I just want to say thank you all. I'm just stunned at the level of participation over like hour 8 of this training event. So I think it's truly stellar. I tell other groups about how committed this team is and they just can't believe it. So thank you all. And we'll be in touch soon with all the new training videos coming out. So I look forward to interacting with all of you.
Thanks, Chris. I just want to echo the same. I mean, just thrilled about the last 2 days and the energy and the level of engagement across the network and all the different independent efforts that are coming together beautifully. So wonderful effort. And just a big thank you to the advisory board for all of their great feedback and input. I'm so grateful that Rob cut me off and I didn't have to tiptoe through Trey Hill's landmines that he placed in front of me. So that was a really big win for me today, because I know I would have stumbled through that. I certainly have a lot of things to say on that, Trey, and we can dial back into that at another time, because there's a lot of things that our networking team is doing and can do around those questions, but there are some of the things that we can't do and that have defined where our role as a network is versus where we see some other players in this space are hitting well. And so that's a great conversation for another day, and I look forward to that meeting where we can dive through all of that. But we certainly really resonate with all of your questions and thinking hard about how we can address many of them, and will be, and certainly appreciate Brandon closing comment as well. You know, that we too are dripping with excitement and desire to turn that corner on releasing a bunch of these tools and having them in that space with you guys, and are moving full steam ahead at a rapid pace. So more to come. Thank you for all the great feedback, and just thrilled to have you guys part of informing our process.